Welcome back. This is our fourth lecture on consciousness. As you recall, in the last lecture, we spent a great deal of time analyzing how scientists probe the difference in the response of the brain to stimuli which are either consciously perceived or not. And very intriguing experiments have been designed to exactly home in on that difference. However, as much as these experiments try to be careful about contaminating factors, they are still abundant, because we need to interrogate the subject whether or not a stimulus was perceived. The very fact that stimuli are impacting the brain is in some way a contaminant already of the neuronal correlates of consciousness that we want to discover. Now, there is one solution, of course, and that is the state of dreaming. While we dream, we are offline. We have no sensory input, and yet the brain is creating full experiences in the visual, auditory domain. Entire narratives are being related in the dream, which can be vivid and extremely lifelike. So we will discuss today two papers. The major one is again from the lab of Giulio Tononi, who has made appearances before and will make an appearance in our next presentation when we elaborate on his integrated information theory of consciousness. He's a very creative psychiatrist out of the University of Wisconsin who seems to be really on the verge of cracking some important problems in consciousness research. So what he set out to do is investigate dreaming in a number of subjects in the laboratory. And what has been done is multiple awakenings upon which the subject is being asked whether or not a dream has occurred. Now, the subject is wired up with multiple electrodes and a continuous stream of EEG data is recorded from the brain. Now, here in the first slide, we see the title, The Neural Correlates of Dreaming. And the idea is to contrast the presence and absence of dreaming in both non-REM and REM sleep. Now, this may come as a surprise because we are taught that REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, is of course that state in the EEG correlated with dreaming, but not so. We dream in non-REM sleep as well. So in both non-REM and REM sleep, reports of dream experience are associated with changes in the frequency of the EEG, in particular in posterior cortical regions. And the high frequency activity in those same regions is correlated with specific dream contents. Now, that is quite a claim, and we will unpack this. Now, importantly, he calls this posterior zone the posterior hot zone. And that hot zone has made an appearance in our second lecture on consciousness when we discussed a paper written by both Giulio Tononi and other authors to delineate where in the brain does consciousness occur. So in the first slide then is the experiment which talks about the setup and differentiates dreaming experience, DE, from dreaming experience without recall and dreaming experience with recall and no dreaming experience at all. So these are the three different states of consciousness, in a sense, that can be tapped into while the subject is sleeping and its brain is offline and not connected to the world. So here is one of the subjects, of course, and you see this electrode array. There are 200 some electrodes on the surface of the scalp as well as on the face and the forehead to record activity originating from the cortex as well as from face muscles, which can be subtracted and used to eliminate the noise that comes from the environment, the subject, and the apparatus itself. So just to remind you of the classical canonical activities of waveforms that we see in sleep. If we put an electrode directly into a cell, we get the intracellular recording and we get spike rates, the firing of individual neurons that we can track. If an electrode is outside the cell, the neuron, we get only spikes without a more delineated description of the spiking activity. And if we sample the EEG from the surface of the brain, we get these different waveforms: high frequency, low voltage, low frequency, high voltage waveforms. And these have been correlated classically with various states of sleep. Now, during REM sleep, you see that the eye movements are active as seen here, and this is of course the classical REM. Now, the electromyogram records muscle activity, and muscle activity in REM is totally shut down. And that's the classical idea that we had about dreaming, namely that we are paralyzed, but our eye movements are moving about inside our skull, and that has been identified as the canonical REM dream state. There are many different transmitters involved in these different states. We will not get involved in these details at this time. Now here is a very detailed description of the various physiological events. This is available to you as a clickable item in the presentation page. So what are the findings? Well, the prediction was that dreaming should be associated with a decrease in slow wave activity, namely between 1 and 4 hertz. And that is exactly what happens. You can see here in posterior brain regions, there is a decrease in the slow wave activity. And it's restricted really to posterior brain regions. Here's the lateral aspect, here's the medial aspect of the hemispheres. So why slow wave? Because in vegetative states and in deep unconsciousness during anesthesia, for example, we get a great deal of slow wave activity that correlates with a profound loss of consciousness. So as you dream in non-REM dreaming, that slow wave activity should decrease and allow the brain to activate more heavily and regionally in order to produce the dream state. Now, how about higher frequency activity, such as 25 to 50 hertz, so-called gamma activity? Gamma activity has been invoked as that activity that allows nerve cells to connect with each other, to form networks that are correlated with each other. And as you can see, we again have the increased activity here now in the dream state. And interestingly, the activity goes further and anterior towards the frontal lobe, where the active memory encoding of the dream state will take place in such a way that subjects upon awakening can relate what they had dreamt about. So here we have a contrast between, again, the experience of dream and non-dream experience, but the inability was found of reporting any dream content. So although the subject is not able to recall specific dream content, the EEG signal suggests that dreaming, in fact, took place. So here then is a comparison of REM and non-REM sleep. And you can see that the 1 to 4 Hertz activity is decreased, and in the medial and the lateral aspects of the brain. And in REM sleep, we have the same phenomenon. So REM versus non-REM, both states of sleep are associated with a decrease in the activity of slow wave activity. So here we have the non-REM sleep dreaming experience versus no experience. And if you have a dream experience that you can recall, there is massive activation of various centers in the brain, mostly posterior areas, but also encroaching on more frontal areas and even prefrontal areas. Now, recall versus non-recall is differentiated really by the fact that more frontal areas are required for recall to take place, whereas with no recall, mostly posterior areas are activated. So here we have REM sleep now, as opposed to non-REM sleep, and the same phenomenon holds. So dreaming experience versus no dreaming experience in REM sleep. So not all REM sleep is associated with the experience of dreaming. We see here the increased high-frequency gamma activity in more frontal regions. Here is the cingulate cortex and the precuneus, centrally medial structures that have to do with sense of self, self-rumination, self-reflection, as we have discussed in many instances in our series on meditation. Now, can the researchers look at the content of the dream? For example, can we differentiate from the EEG signal whether thinking or perceiving was involved? Did the dreamer reflect on things or worry about things, or was it just a purely visual experience? And you can see that when thinking was involved, or rumination, that the frontal areas here stand out, just as they would in the waking state, indicating that the dream state repeats the conscious state repertory that the brain engages when we have thought experiences or rumination type of experiences. So there are different perceptual categories, of course. For example, seeing faces. Now, much brain territory has been invested in face recognition. Faces are extremely important for social interactions, and our brains are expert at detecting faces, recognizing faces among many other faces. Only recently has artificial intelligence caught up with face recognition algorithms by Google and others, which use neural type networks and machine learning. And now these networks have gotten so good that they equal the human capacity for face recognition. But where in the brain does it happen? Well, it happens in the temporal lobe area, in the face recognition area. And here you see that when subjects report seeing faces in their dream, this is exactly the area that lights up. So again, just with dreams focusing on thoughts, dreams focusing on faces and face recognition light up the exactly equivalent areas that would be activated during waking conscious experiences, making the point that dream consciousness and waking consciousness are very much equivalent and are very difficult to differentiate just from this EEG type signal. Now, how about other items such as space or walking through space? So dreamers will report walking through a house or walking through a garden. And when those contents were reported, you can sift through the EEG channels and find that, yes, in the parietal lobe, that brain area involved in spatial navigation, a strong signal emerges, just like it would in the waking conscious state. So here now we have spatial settings, which we discussed already, and here's movement. So movement areas in the waking states are in the posterior parietal area. And here you can see the same area lighting up in the dreamlike state. How about speech? We have speech areas in the brain, such as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And here in the temporal lobe area is Wernicke's speech center. And you can see that it lights up if you have a dream in which speech or speech perception is a prominent feature. So to summarize then, so far what we have seen is that you can detect in the sleeping brain, in the dreaming sleeping brain, the same hallmarks of brain activity that are associated with certain cognitive activities such as walking through a space, thinking about some content, recognizing a face, spatial orientation, and such, making the case that the dream conscious state is very equivalent to the waking conscious state. Now, can we predict, given this data, whether somebody is dreaming? If we awake a person, can we predict from the EEG signature whether somebody is in the dreaming state? And this is not just looking at rapid eye movements, but at the general EEG signature. And you can see certain cutoffs in the spectral composition are chosen, of course, to make this prediction. And yes, you can. If you have a dreaming experience, the low frequency power in your EEG waves is significantly decreased compared to the non-dreaming experience over here. These are extremely statistically significant results. Same is true for the posterior power, the high frequency power, the posterior hot zone. And you can see that the dreaming experience has a high amount of high gamma activity in the posterior hot zone compared to a non-dreaming experience upon awakening. So these are then the areas that are different in the dream experience. In non-REM sleep, we already went over this, so we will continue. And here is a summary of the results in a sense. So all these experiments described so far highlighted a parietal occipital hot zone as the neurochondral correlate of dreaming. When this posterior hot zone showed a decrease in low-frequency EEG activity, traditionally known as EEG activation, subjects reported upon awakening that they had dream experiences. By contrast, when the low-frequency EEG activity increased in the same areas, subjects reported they had been unconscious. So in both REM and non-REM sleep, dreaming and more generally conscious experience during sleep require a localized activation of the posterior hot zone, irrespective of the EEG in the rest of the cortex. So this posterior hot zone then includes a number of regions which have prominently features in other lectures we have had, including the precuneus, the posterior cingulate, and the retrosplenial cortices. These are areas in the medial surface of the brain that, when they are stimulated in patients undergoing neurosurgery, are often associated with feelings of being in a parallel world or disconnected from the environment in a, quote, dreamlike state, and whose involvement in multisensory integration is well suited to support both the virtual stimulation, the virtual simulation of a world, the virtual simulation of a world, and the immersive spatio-temporal hallucinations that characterize dreams. So what the authors are saying is this: in the dream state, you create a virtual reality from your brain activity alone. And certain brain areas are particularly active in creating this immersive spatiotemporal experience in your brain. Now, that then suggests that analyzing dreams might really be a royal road to consciousness, paraphrasing Sigmund Freud's statement that dreams or dream interpretation is the royal road to the unconscious. So this is an inversion of Dr. Freud's statement, namely saying that dreams may in fact be a royal road to understanding the neuronal correlates of consciousness. Now, this same approach has been pushed to an even higher degree by a group in Japan. And these researchers have shown that you can decode from dream states the content of a dream. Let me tell you how this is done. So here is a person in the MRI machine before awakening, and MRI signals are collected and they are put into an artificial intelligence neuronal network, a machine learning decoder. And so this decoder then will have to learn a number of things. Number one, it will have to learn vocabulary, such as person, key, chair, bed, and so on. And it will use these items in a tree-type hierarchical structure that allow the neuronal network to make sense out of different words such as street, for example, and house. So consider what is done here. We're looking at a signal from the brain, a multivoxel, multivariate signal from different brain regions. And we attempt to teach the machine to find those echoes that relate to a certain vocabulary that is involved in a world net structure. So what do we find? Well, we can now teach the machine a correlation between images and these word tree structures as it's done here. So web images are now available by the millions, and the machines can be taught these images, and classifiers can be developed in artificial intelligence which will tell you what the machine saw, namely buildings, or food, or faces. And this then can be correlated with the other system we have developed, namely the word structure or the word tree structure. Now those two things put together then may allow you to verbalize the dream content that the sleeper was experiencing. And here is what happens. In the higher visual cortices, HVC, we can see a decoding accuracy increasing. So the predictions of what the dreamer has seen by the machine is increasing the farther you go from the lower visual cortex to the higher visual cortex. Same is expressed here. Higher visual cortex, lower visual cortex, making the case that the integration of visual content does not appear to be in V1 and V2, but somewhere higher in the visual cortex hierarchy. So this is a remarkable finding. You can spy on somebody's dreams by looking at the activity of the brain, which you have then incorporated into a machine learning algorithm, taking into account both learning of visual images and learning of language. So, what this then means is that these findings provide evidence that specific contents of visual experience during sleep are represented by and can be read out from visual cortical activity patterns shared with stimulant representation. The results suggest that the principle of perceptual equivalence, which postulates a common neuronal substrate for perception and imagery, generalizes to spontaneously generated visual experiences during sleep. Again, let's summarize. What all this shows is that when we dream, we create a world as real as any other. We use brain regions that we also invoke in decoding images, language, navigate space as we would in waking consciousness. So then the dream suggests itself as an ideal mechanism, the study of the dream, to home in on the neuronal correlates of consciousness, uncontaminated by any input from the world, from the experimenter, or anything else. Just an internally generated virtual environment, and we can look at the brain and check, how does the brain do this? How does the brain create the conscious experience of an internal world, an ideal setup? So this is a paper that just appeared a couple of weeks ago in Nature Neuroscience out of the laboratory of Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin. A remarkable finding, and I think more will be said about that in later lectures. The next lecture will focus on the integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi. And it is likewise a quite revolutionary approach to conceptualizing consciousness, and it's winning more and more followers, including Christoph Koch, who is one of the pioneers in looking at the neuronal correlates of consciousness. So thank you for your attention, and we'll see you soon for the next lecture on consciousness at Behavioral Health 2000.